So last but not least, we have Larry Morris. After a 45-year career in the computer and software industry, Larry needed something else to challenge him in retirement. He started writing science fiction in 2011 and has since published 12 books and two short stories. His books cover a wide range of topics, including our first exploration of space in his Push to the Star series, Multi-Universe and Pathway to the Anyverse, The Origin of Our Species in Close to Home, Space Adventure in Salvage, Multidimension and New Territory, and others. 4 of his books and both short stories have won major awards from the Texas Authors Association. Larry and his wife, Michelle, currently live on rural property west of Wimberley, Texas, with 2 big lazy cats. Everyone, welcome Larry.
Thank you. I'm Larry Morris, and thanks again to Seguin Library for hosting this. Is this the second, third, fourth Indie Authors Day? Third Indie Authors Day. And thanks for having me back again this year. This is an excerpt from my latest book called Who Owns Tomorrow, which was published just about 2 or 3 months ago. And it explores a few notions about time travel. From the back cover of the book, first of all, just a sentence. How bad would things have to be for you to believe you needed to contact yourself in the past and try to convince past you not to do something you had already done? That kind of gives you an idea of what the book's about. This excerpt is actually the first 3 or 4 pages of the book. We were always taught that if you can't grab the reader's attention in the first 2 or 3 pages, you've lost them, so let's see if it works. Karen sat at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, looking out the window past the deck, relishing the new snow. It was still pretty early, at least for everyone else, and the sun was not yet fully up. Shadows were just starting to creep from the trees, and the new fallen snow was beginning to glisten. This was her favorite time of the day, before anyone else moved and spoiled the scene. She could sit there for hours this time of year and just watch the snow and the small animals that would scurry around the neighborhood. This ritual was the only thing that made it bearable when Brian was gone on a long deployment. When his submarine deployed, it was usually for a 3-month trip, and she never knew where he was or if he would be back on time or ever be back at all. Communications to and from the nuclear subfleet was strictly monitored, and family conversations during deployment were frowned upon. The cottontail had found a hole in the back fence and hopped across the backyard. When it was even with the deck and the window Karen looked out of, it stopped and sat up and looked right at her, white on white. This was an everyday occurrence in the winters, where she had grown up in northern Indiana, close to the Michigan border, but not as often here, just outside the nation's capital. So she took advantage of these moments whenever they happened. The cottontail hopped off back through the hole in the fence, and Karen continued to sit and watch. But as always, eventually, she had to get to work. There were things going on that she was responsible for, and much as she liked how it was right here, she knew she couldn't stay. She sipped her coffee and watched the wind swirl the powdery snow when she had the overwhelming feeling that this was somehow vaguely familiar. Not familiar as in she did this all the time, but familiar as in she had done exactly this before. That was when she first heard the noise. It didn't sound like anything in particular at first, just a noise. But the more she strained to listen, the more it actually sounded like someone softly calling her name. She stood up and held her breath and cocked her head in the direction of the sound. She tried to concentrate to make sure what she thought was hearing was real. "Karen," the voice said. "Karen, can you hear me?" It was a woman's voice, and it sounded like it was coming from behind her. She grabbed the table with her left hand and set her coffee down hard enough to spill some of it on the table. She spun around and looked behind her. "Was someone there?" she asked out loud, her eyes darting around the kitchen. There was no one else there, just her and Sebastian. She moved slowly towards the short hallway between the kitchen and the front foyer. Sebastian watched her from the safety of his bed in the corner of the kitchen. He yawned and stretched. He got up and turned around a couple of times. in true cat fashion before he finally sat on his haunches and continued to watch her. He had been asleep and had not heard the voice the first time, so he was curious about what she was doing. Karen got to the hallway and snapped on the light. It was empty. She touched a small picture frame on the lower left corner, and it tilted down to reveal a concealed compartment. She reached in and pulled out the SIG P-29 with her right hand. Not many things would stay standing after a couple of rounds from her trusted .40 caliber. She pushed open the door to the small powder room on the right. It was empty. "What's going on here, Bastian?" she asked. She looked over her shoulder at the cat, and he tilted his head to one side. "You're supposed to tell me when something out of the ordinary is happening. I think you slept too late this morning." Then she heard the voice again. This time it was clearer, and it was obvious it was coming from the foyer. "Karen, please, can you hear me?" Sebastian heard it this time and sat up a little straighter. He looked at Karen, trying to take his cue from his mistress. Not much flustered the big Tom, but this was a voice where there shouldn't be one. He was familiar enough with his owner's routine to know she was supposed to be alone at this time of the morning when Brian was gone. Karen reached her free hand around the wall into the foyer and flipped the light switch while she was still standing in the little hallway. She pushed back the hammer on the SIG and peeked quickly around the corner. Light flooded the small foyer, split into a rainbow by the cut glass of the front door. She surveyed the small space from the hallway, taking her time there. There was no one there, just a hat rack, the front door, and an old antique sideboard with a large beveled glass mirror. She could see the alarm monitoring unit on the wall by the front door, and it was still armed, just the way she had left it last night before she went to bed. No one else was in the house. She walked over to the sideboard and looked in the mirror. Sebastian startled her as he rubbed up against her leg, and she almost fell backwards. "Damn it, Sebastian," she said, "let me know when you're about to scare the shit out of me." She bent down to pet the cat, and the voice came again. "Karen," was all the voice said. When Karen stood back up and looked at the mirror in the sideboard, she thought she saw something besides her own reflection. She thought she saw another her looking back. It was fuzzy and wavy like something you would see through a heat wave, but it sure looked like her. Of course, that was crazy. It must have been her imagination. She backed up to the doorway and into the hallway and grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. Her head was swimming, and for a minute she was sure she was about to faint, but she held on. She didn't know what this was, but it scared the daylights out of her. She collected herself and stepped back into the foyer in front of the sideboard. The image of the voice had faded, and just the mirror remained. She stood there for a full 10 minutes watching, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. She decocked the SIG and put it back in its holder inside the picture frame and closed the frame. She shook her head and retrieved the coffee from the kitchen table and wiped up the spill with a couple of paper towels. She stood at the kitchen table sipping coffee and thinking about what had just happened. She really had no choice. She pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a 911 text to a local number and looked at her watch. She figured she had about 15 minutes before they showed up, so she turned off the alarm and headed upstairs for a quick shower. Her front door had a keypad lock instead of a key lock, and the folks who were going to respond to her 911 request had the code to get into the house. On the way, she stopped at the wet bar on the second floor for a scotch. It may have been early, but coffee by itself just wasn't going to cut it today. Not knowing what else to do at the moment, Sebastian followed her upstairs, talking all the way. She paused at the bedroom door and took a long pull from the scotch. Something about the encounter this morning was nagging at her. Not just how strange it was, there was, of course, that, but there was something else. If she held her head just right and closed her eyes, she could remember something. Again, the feeling that this was all so familiar, but then it was gone, just a fleeting memory fragment. She finished the scotch in one swallow and headed into the bedroom for a shower. Thanks for the opportunity, for the reading. If you would like to